Hello, welcome to Potovirus Podcast. We are here. This is episode number 6, and we have Amanda and Mayukh from Phiogen Pharmaceuticals. So this is continuing in our phage therapy series that Joe and I have started. You may have heard our most recent couple of episodes with Gina Sa and Sandro Sulak-Velidze. So we're getting a few different perspectives from the physician side, from the company that's been in this space for 26 years side, and now we have a new company in the phage therapy space. So I'm really excited to chat with you guys today. And the specific topic that we really wanted to cover is a bit of a deviation from just like, what does a phage therapy company care about and what are they trying to do? But pricing. So how do we think about drug pricing in the phage therapy context? A bunch of people, including my partner Jan, was saying, talk to Amanda. They're thinking about this. And like, that's been kind of such a question for us for a while now, is just how does the financial side work? And does innovation, is it required here for phage therapy to actually work? There's the component of whether it actually treats infection, but also like, does it work as a business? And as we've been seeing for years and heard about, the antibiotics are just such a hard business. So how come we can even do phage therapy? Like, is it going to suffer all of the same problems as antibiotics? Or can we go towards something like CAR T cells where they apparently pay, people are paying $500,000 or $1 million for a treatment? So where does phage land? How are you guys thinking about this? That's where I really would like this conversation to go. But also we really want to hear just like some intro and of course what you guys are actually doing and how Phiogen exists in this phage therapy space. So I will pass it to you, Amanda. Maybe give a little intro of yourself too, and then tell us a little bit about Phiogen first.
Sure. Well, thank you, Jessica. Happy to be here with our favorite phage friends, Joe and yourself, and of course, Mayukh as well, who's on the call. So thank you for having us. As you mentioned, I would argue we're probably the newest, if not one of the newer entrants into the phage field. So Phiogen was born off a spinoff off of Baylor College of Medicine that was really developed on the backbone of an R&D program that was initiated by Dr. Anthony Moresso and his group there at TAILOR Labs. And the college really looked at what the Moresso group was doing, treating these patients under emergency use authorization. So I think you spoke with Gina recently. Gina has worked with the Moresso group for a while, actually treating patients with phage. And what they had found was at the time when the college was really looking at spinning off a commercial opportunity, they saw that there were 12 patients treated and with varying degrees of success and outcomes. And really, they were trying to build the business case of if there was an opportunity, a commercial opportunity, because the way that TAILOR works is academic and nonprofit. And so myself and another consultant came together and really looked at the business case for developing a fixed phage drug product. And yeah, did a big project, and really the college decided that there was an opportunity, set aside some seed fundings, and that was essentially how Phiogen was developed. And I always say we're a backwards startup because we got to come into the game with knowing whether or not these phages worked in our target patient population through these EIND cases, which is really unique for a startup. It's very rare that they get to come in knowing that their product works in humans. So that really kind of built the business case for us that there was opportunity. So that was about 18 months ago. So since then, we have grown the team. We've had the esteemed pleasure of welcoming our Chief Operations Officer, Dr. Mayukh Das. He is a phage biologist by training, but his background has been spanned across the world to include developing phage products in large pharma. And so he really brings a unique perspective to what we're doing. We have some research technicians that are in the lab building out our R&D roadmap. And then, of course, we work closely with the group, the phage biologists at Baylor College of Medicine, really guiding our R&D pathway and strategy overall. So It's been a whirlwind of a ride. We are now at the stage where we are planning for a clinical trial and really working with our clinical advisory board to build that out. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that by this time the interview comes out, we will have announced that we have a collaboration with Live UTI Free, which is a patient advocacy group. And
Awesome.
the whole goal is to develop our Phage product to be patient centric and really bring that patient journey and voice along. And so we are in now trying to raise some capital to fund that clinical trial. So really excited about that. So I'm a recovering molecular biologist that flipped over to the dark side and got an MBA. So that's a little bit about my background and the team. And then I don't know if you want Mayukh to say a few words about himself.
Yeah, go for it.
Thank you, Amanda, for the nice introduction, and thanks to Jessica and Joe for having us here. I mean, as Amanda mentioned, this is one of our favorite show, and as a phage biologist, I mean, I have been following this porovirus, and this is really incredible. I mean, Jessica, and thanks to you. I mean, you have been doing this great. Little bit about me. As Amanda mentioned, that I did my PhD in bacteriophage biology, also in a medical microbiology in a WH Institute in India. That was a bibliophage reference laboratory as well. I mean, that's how I first learned how to work with bacteriophages and how to utilize that as a potential therapeutic agent to treat different antimicrobial resistant bacteria. And then I started my another 10 years of journey in Center for Phage Technology, where I was leading a drug development process, which was to develop a biopesticide for the wine industry, which is
You were part of
currently in
that.
the... Yeah, I was part of that.
That's amazing.
And yeah. That actually, I learned a lot that 10 years. I was also doing multiple other things when I was in CPT. Like I got an opportunity to involve in the famous Patterson case. Inside the team researching the phages. And also we had another case from Mallory Smith. And so I was a part of the team as well. And then I joined in Johnson & Johnson for their phage therapy drug development process. I was leading the team. And then today I got the opportunity to work with this our amazing team in Phiogen. So I'm hoping to bring the phage therapy as a mainstream in the market to combat the AMR crisis.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you. That's perfect. Joe, do you want to start us off with the questioning, or what is your burning question on this topic to get us going?
Well, I guess we should probably just start with the first question we wrote in, told Amanda we were going to ask her. Can you tell us about, I think you told us a little bit about Phiogen's journey, and what's the approach you're taking?
Yeah, sure. So when we first set out to develop a phage company, we knew right off the bat we really had to differentiate ourselves for a lot of different reasons. Going through this journey, it's been very informative because different people have different preset notions of phage. And it depends on how much they've been exposed to phage on really what their insight is. So I have talked to people who are huge phage fans and really see phage as becoming a mainstream medical solution to, using phage first and really stewarding antibiotics. To people who are huge phage skeptics and don't believe there's a business model for phage, and that they cite a lot of the failed clinical trials in the past and the broken antibiotics market, all the way to the phage lukewarmers who have heard about it but are waiting to see somebody else step in and create whatever the magic inflection point is, which changes with different people. Some people don't put a lot of merit into the EIND cases. Some people do. Some people say phase 2 top line readout would be enough. Some people say acquisition play by large pharma. So it has been incredibly revealing, the spectrum of feelings and attitudes towards phage, depending on who you talk to, where they are, and where they see the value. So we went into this thing kind of eyes wide open, knowing that we really had to be differentiated. And I've said this before in the past, and I feel like all of the phage companies now are having to pay for the sins of those that came before us. And so it's been a little bit of an uphill battle, I will say. We've really had to convince people what we're doing is impactful and meaningful, and there is a place for phage amongst the conventional treatments for antibacterial infections. And it's been harder than I thought it would be, I'll be honest. So when we went out to develop a product, we knew we had to be differentiated. And one of the ways that we really try to do that is we've created a 6-step technology platform that is high throughput. And part of that is at the core of our technology platform, we have something called the directed evolution machine. This allows us, there are 2 business models of phage. You could have the naturally occurring phages, or you can have the CRISPR-Cas9. And I always say we're the missing middle ground. So we combine the best science of both. And the way we're able to do that is by this directed evolution machine that allows us to selectively pressure phages that we find have antibacterial capabilities that we want to enhance. So an example of this, which you can read publications online, is that we found a phage that was hyperlytic. It killed very, very quickly, but the host range wasn't as broad as we want it to be. And so we ran it through our machine. And after 4 hours, we were able to evolve an offspring phage, which had increased its host range, I think, to the tune of 10 to 15%. And so this was really impactful because it proved to us that by utilizing some high throughput methods, we could actually train phages in a way that hadn't been done before. And we're able to utilize this machine to enhance whatever antibacterial capabilities we want. So let's say we see a phage that has good biofilm busting capabilities. We can enhance that feature by running it through this machine. If we want a phage that stimulates the immune system, we can enhance that by running it through this machine. So it's a really smart way to develop a drug product, specifically biologic, which is something you can't do with a small molecule. The other thing that is really important that we made sure to include in our technology platform is bioclimatic screening. And this is a step I think a lot of other phage companies, I would argue, undervalue. So bioclimatic screening, if you can imagine that phage have always been in an evolutionary arms race with bacteria. And if you were to ask our founding scientist, he would tell you like phage have already solved the problems that bacteria present. You just have to find them. And so that's what this bioclimatic screening process is about. So we have 3D organoid models in which we actually screen phages through. And this is really important. And a prime example is another paper you could look at about a phage that we found that through your normal traditional phage screening methods was a poor killer. You would never select this phage. We have a whole panel of phages that we looked at, and it was one of the worst killers. You would never select it on a normal plate assay. However, if you were to screen this phage in the presence of mucin, what we found is that this phage had specifically evolved an adaptation through the millennia of its, genealogy, had specifically evolved an adaptation where it actually co-located next to its E. coli host. And this has allowed it to basically have this locational positioning to enhance its ability to reproduce. And once you put it in the presence of mucin, we found that this phage was actually one of the best killers. And if you were to do normal screening, you would have never selected it. And so very early on, we found that if you don't have this as part of your technology platform, you're going to miss really important phages. And so we've really honed in on that aspect, and that's how we found a lot of these phages. So once we find the phage with these unique properties, we can run it through our machine to enhance those capabilities. And what it allows us to do through this test cascade is essentially have a very high performing, targeted, fixed drug product with phages that have specific jobs that they've been enhanced to do. And so we've really intentionally built our drug products to be that way and to be infection centric. So if you have a infection where biofilms are a problem, you want to make sure that you have a phage that's addressing biofilm. And so that's kind of the way we've tried to develop our drug products and to really be differentiated.
So,
Awesome.
if I could just follow up on one thing you said, when you were talking about funders and people, do you think there's more negativity that's broadly against the business of treating AMR infections, or do you think it's phage specific? I guess when you get skepticism from investors, I imagine some of them are both ways. I mean, some people who wouldn't care whether it was a phage or a traditional antibiotic, they just think it's a bad business model right now. Or do you find, is that the bigger stumbling block in terms of getting people to give you money, or is it that they're skeptical about phage for whatever myriad of reasons they might be skeptical about phage?
It's a really great question. And I have to be a little careful how I answer this because I will say overwhelmingly, like getting our foot through the door to any VC, as soon as they hear we're infectious disease, their eyes kind of get big. And then they hear we're antibacterial, their eyes get bigger. And then they hear we're not small molecule. It's like all the alarm bells are ringing. So I will say just getting our foot through the door to talk to traditional VCs has been a very difficult one. So to answer the first part of your question, Joe, I think there is a huge bias against anti-infective companies because the ROI is relatively so substantially lower than what you're going to find with an oncology company or the intersection of an AI and a healthcare company. The risk is a lot higher, and the ROI, I think you could say, arguably can be lower, and especially because we're in a space that hasn't proven out to be successful yet. There has been no large acquisition of a phage company from a large pharma, I would argue, and there's been no FDA-approved product. So it is. I mean, it's an uphill battle for a lot of different things. It's infectious disease, which people see as low ROI, I would say, overwhelmingly. These are blanket statements, by the way. So that's a problem. You are in a even harder space, which is antibacterial. Fungal, on the other hand, has experienced very successful fundraising efforts, I would argue. Antibacterial is not quite the same, and antivirals kind of in a space of their own, especially now because we have the mRNA vaccines and such. So antibacterial is kind of like, the black sheep, I would say. So you have low faith and anti-infectives, relatively low ROI, antibacterial even worse. You have the undermining of it. You have stewardship efforts that are in place, which makes it even harder. You have an unproven modality with a checkered past, and the business case of it. If you were just treating, how are you going to make money, especially if the infection comes back? And I would say, for really add on to what we're doing, that is another piece that we've had to add as our value proposition, is that we're using phage in a way that others are not, in that we are trying to treat and prevent, but not prevent in the traditional phage sense, that's microbiome editing. We're really finding phage that stimulate the immune system as the bacteria are being killed. And so this allows for what we're calling dual action therapeutic use. So the treat and prevent modality, which is no one's ever really been able to do that with phage in the past. And so there's a huge education piece that we're having to fight against. So to answer your question initially, are there biases? I would say yes. Against phage, I think, we are paying for some of the sins of others that have come before us, but also too, it's just not been proven. And so there's a lot of things that we're fighting against that are yet to be seen, I think.
Great.
So sorry, Jessica, I'm going to let you ask some questions. I just want to make completely clear. ROI is return on investment. And I'm just saying that because we may have some people who listen to this who are more science geeks like me who aren't into the business logo. But why don't you continue, Jess?
Yeah. No, thanks. This is great. I'm glad that we went in this direction. So everyone, I feel like the elephant in the room, and it's not always clear, especially to our audience on this, which is the new podcast. We're still figuring out who that is, but it's probably all the phage friends to start with. But there's still constantly this question circulating and like just what everybody says, that antibiotics are a bad business model, and like, you just see big pharma exiting the antimicrobial space over and over. And if any of us, like, I go to, startup events in San Francisco, and I'll tell someone I'm working on phage therapy, and if it's an investor or someone, they're always like, "Ooh, like, why would you go into that? It's like, it just makes no money." And so so this has been said for so long, and recently, I think too, the whole Phiogen story kind of became more analyzed. And just to give some background on that, like, this company that was an antibiotics company, like, had a new antibiotic, and everybody was so excited about it throughout the 2000s and 2010s. And then it even got its drug on the market, and then it started to sell it, and it just barely made any money compared to what it expected. And then it went bankrupt. So even if there's a sense that even if it works, it's not enough. So to what extent do you feel like this kind of cautionary tale, is it more lore? Is it real? Like, is it, because even if, like, that one worked. And so if your differentiating factor is that your system works, how is that enough? Or are we overblowing how this whole, this ominous kind of situation is?
Yeah, it's a really important point. And honestly, I know a lot of people probably point to that and say, look, it failed. But honestly, if you go through and you really go through the post-mortem, it's extremely informative. And for anybody listening to this podcast, anybody that's in the phage space, I would forward and backwards read through that story and really take it on board, because even though it's small molecule, there are so many learnings from that. And Carrie Furr put on a workshop this year earlier. Mayukh also put on another workshop as well at the Bacteriophage Summit that happened in Boston. And she actually had Ryan, I think was the name of the CEO of that antibiotic company, come, and he did the post-mortem before this paper was published. And he just brought up point after point after point that were so useful. And so for anybody developing a phage product, please read that document and learn that story, because there's so many things that we as phage developers will need to know going eyes wide open into this process. The number one point, which I hope was pulled out of that paper, was one of the reasons that they had to fold was because of the post-market monitoring and obligations that they were required to continue developing, which is normal for any and all drug developers. But that essentially their investor base, I think it was to the tune, don't quote me on this, something around 30 million. I mean, it was a large price tag. And it was just the continued monitoring. They had to do a pediatrics trial, even though it was for, UTI that normally affects only adults. And so there are all these other things that were tacked on that were required even after FDA approval. And so that was part of the reason why, too, this just unsustainable business model. And so, and you look at the last 7 antibiotic companies that got FDA approval have had gone bankrupt. And a lot of it had to do with kind of this post-monitoring and this requirements of the FDA. And then also the other thing we have to look at is reimbursement, which is something that up until last week was not discussed in the phage world. But I'm happy to through some poking, prodding, and goading, there was, for the first time ever, a phage therapy reimbursement discussion that was held, workshop, and it was very informative, and Mayukh can touch on that shortly. But the other thing that came from this, and I'm going to say it wrong, is it a Phiogen story?
I think, yeah.
Really is, the thing that was pulled out is if you're making an antimicrobial for a small population size, or if it is, the label claim is for a subsegment of population, that there's not a sustainable business model for it. And I would say, arguably, that has validity. Antibiotics are good for the most part, for a one-time fix, which means that product, if it works, is going to be used once. And so if you have a price point that is low, that means that you're going to sell that low price point once. And so if you don't have the volume that, it's a little bit going back to economics 101, supply and demand. So if you don't have the volume that allows you to have a lower price point, you're going to have a hard time making profits and making a margin. On the flip side, if you have a really high price point but a low volume, you're going to have reimbursements that allow for that, and you're going to have to completely change the entire conversation around antibiotics because antibiotics have a very low price point. And so it's just this very dichotomous checks and balance system. And one of the reasons why there has to be pull incentives, because at the moment, if you're creating a product for one-time use that either is beholden to stewardship policies, clinicians aren't familiar with it, or you have a limited patient population, all of those things are decreasing your volume. Yeah, and if you don't have a high price point on that, how are you supposed to make money? And how are investors eventually supposed to get a return? And so very, very difficult. And so a few things have to change. Either there has to be pull incentives or push incentives that are put into place, which are currently being discussed now. You have to have a product that garners a higher price point, which means you have to have a truly value differentiating proposition for what you're doing. So you have to do something other than just a one-time treatment. And you have to get clinicians on board, and you have to find a patient population that fits that label claim of whatever you're going after, or has the unmet need where you can charge a higher price point and get payers on board that they will reimburse that, because in the end run, it negates that person from going into a hospital and having a more severe progression of that infection. But all of those stars have to align, and it's all around a relatively, for Phage, I would argue, unproven product. And so it's a whole conversation piece that a lot of investors are just like, it's too risky. I have oncology that I can invest in, all these AI, med techs that are coming up that I can invest in. I'll just wait another few years until there's a success case. So,
do you think there are ways for companies for organizations other than governments to provide the pull incentives? And I guess I'm thinking about one thing, like, you can make an argument, and this would sort of require almost cooperation between insurance companies, and I don't know that they do this, but you mentioned, keeping people out of hospitals, or, keeping people who are in hospitals not infective. That sort of benefits, in a way, or could potentially benefit all the patients in the hospital, regardless of whether they're covered by the insurance company that the infected person is, because you'll make it less likely that you'll make it less likely that that the infection will spread to other patients. Mm-hmm. So, but it seems to me, not being a business guy, that really the only person that's going to really probably agency is the government that can really do that.
Yeah. It's a really important question. And in fact, I don't know, Mayukh, if you want to say anything about this, because it brings into frame one of the things that is really critical about what anybody that's developing an antimicrobial should be thinking about. And that is your product inpatient? So is it going to be hospital systems, or these outpatient therapeutics that you're trying to develop? And so we talked a little bit about this on the phage therapy workshop last week for reimbursement. So I don't know, Mayukh, do you want to say a few words about how governments or payers should be thinking about this?
Amanda. So the one you mentioned, the reimbursement model, so which is very informative. In fact, the workshop that she mentioned happened last week, and this is the first time in the phage, specifically in the phage field. And usually, like considering the drug pricing, so in the pharmaceutical world is a complex and the multi-step process, which influenced by like a range of factors, which includes your R&D cost, your manufacturing cost, market competition, your regulatory approval, then also like your healthcare. But the one key piece is the reimbursement model, right? So which is, as Amanda mentioned, in the specifically phage space, no one ever talked about. I mean, probably that's the reason that no one ever reached in the finish line yet. The workshop happened last week, was very, very informative because the CMAs, what they mentioned that, and they actually encouraged by mentioning multiple times throughout the workshop that they would like to engaged in the drug development process as early as possible. So
Can you
in
just
that case,
tell us who was saying the CMS? You said, is that Medicare? The Center for Medicare or Medicaid?
Yeah, so the workshop that was put on last week was put on by a consulting group where the CEO was, I think he was either like the president, or he held a high ranking role in CMS, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services. And just to be clear, most private payers will not cover a drug until CMS makes a ruling on it. So the gold standard is if CMS makes a ruling on reimbursement guidelines and policies, then private payers will follow. And so the group last week that put on the workshop, he was head of that for a long time. He's since left that role and is now doing consulting for for drug developers. And specifically, they put on this workshop for phage companies. So just to be
Thank
clear.
you. Sorry, Mayukh, for cutting you off. I just wanted the whole audience to be with us, and I was like, wait a minute. So can you just back up to the point where I cut you off now and keep going?
yeah, sure. I mean, thanks, Amanda, for explaining that one. Yeah, so the one I was telling that the CMAs, what they specifically mentioned that they would prefer to be engaged in the drug development process as early as possible. So in that way, they can actually analyze the need of that specific therapy based on many factors like unmet need, your target population, wherever you are in a specific geographical location, and they can come up with some specific reimbursement model as a suggestion, and that actually can be negotiated with FDA. So that also they did mention that. So in that, so which is a very, very interesting information and very helpful, I would say, specifically for the bacteriophage based drug developer, and which actually never happened before, but that was eye opener for us.
So do they feel like there is a, I guess, yeah, did you get the sense that that Medicare does have a willingness to pay for something like phage therapy, like something that, would they have a willingness to pay for any given clinical indication that's actually at the more like one-time treatment level rate, closer to something like a cancer therapeutic or CAR T? Do you have that sense, or are they kind of still classifying phages always like just like an antibiotic?
No, they are open to for the discussion, and as I mentioned that based on the specific unmet need, based on the target population, they would like to actually do a kind of survey by themselves and come up with a specific reimbursement strategy. So which is really great. I mean, as for example, like the recurrent UTI, the specific target patient population we are targeting for our first product. So people have been suffering years after years due to the different reoccurrence of the UTI. And so so basically they are spending a lot of money in for the healthcare. So if we can bring some product which will reduce that, so that's a huge win.
And I will
So
say
that's
in
unmet
the
need.
workshop last week, they did give two examples of a potential pathway for phage. So there are two LBPs, biologic products, that were approved last year. The first LBPs, and they were both for recurrent bacterial infections, specifically recurrent C. diff. And so these two LBPs are both FMTs, so fecal microbiome transplants. One's just a pure FMT, the other one's FMT spores, and both recurrent C. diff. And I think it draws a pretty good business case because it is a LBP for recurrent infection for patients that once hospitalized with this recurrent infection have extremely high healthcare service. I mean, they're just very high cost on the hospital system. And it really looked at the pricing that these two products had. And the price for the treatment is about to the tune of $10,000 or more for cost of treatment. And payers, actually, there is a reimbursement strategy for each one of these, and they are reimbursed, and they are currently on the market being marketed right now. And one of them has already been acquired by Nestle. So Seres Therapeutics had Vowst, and Phiogen Pharmaceutical had Rebiota. And so they are, I think it's still too early to say whether or not they are successful yet from a drug product standpoint. But what I can say is that there is a prerequisite for how a LBP can get approved, how LBP can get payer designation and reimbursement, and how they could look like in a recurrent infection patient population. And so they kind of did an analysis on how phage would fall underneath the similar pathway. So there is a way to do it, and there is some early evidence that reimbursement is feasible for an extremely high price point for recurrent bacterial infection.
Is 10,000 considered extremely high?
I would argue for a antibiotic alternative, because right now the only way to treat C. diff infections, and I say treat, is with antibiotics, and that only makes the problem harder. So there really is no standard of care for recurrent C. diff. So the only standard of care is antibiotics, which only makes it worse. So I would say if you're comparing, to an antibiotic, $1,000 price tag for treatment is very high.
Because I was reading that Phiogen wanted to charge 15,000, and then they were only able to charge 5,000 or something like that. So it still feels like within the order of magnitude of like what was not enough. How come we're not talking about like hundreds of thousands? Just because that's how much the CAR T cell therapies cost. Like, if we're going to save somebody's life, how come the conversation is anchored so low?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it goes back to how much is that patient going to cost at the end of the day. And I hate that because it boils people down to dollar figures, but that's essentially what it is. And, is their infection life-threatening or not? Or is the disease that they have going to be chronic? Is it a one-time fix? How much is that person going to cost the hospital system and the insurers? And unfortunately, that has to be correlated to the price. And I would argue, on the other hand, what's the tolerability for people to pay? You look at some of the oncology treatments and how expensive they are, and they're maybe only guaranteeing a few extra months of life.
Mm-hmm.
But on the flip side, what is that few extra months of life versus them being in a hospital? Or it all goes back to, and what insurers are willing to pay. So I think it's a very complicated health economic issue.
Yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
So I guess when just going back to something that Mayukh said about, calculating the unmet need. And I guess one thing I'm curious about is we have an unmet need, which is the current unmet need. But I would assume that with phages, the unmet need is expected to grow because, as we all know, sadly, the AMR problem is getting worse and worse. So was there any sense that there's any effort to calculate what the unmet need is likely to be in 5 or 10 years when they're figuring out price points and stuff like that?
I did not hear them mention that in the phage therapy workshop. I will say, I have been speaking with some health economists recently because as a company, this is really important for us to get a solid answer and not just, kind of pull a number out of the sky, out of what we think our pricing could be, what we think reimbursement could be from predecessors of LBPs. It's really important for us that we build a business case that's based on reasonable fact as much as we can. And this health economist that we're working with is very well known. And I started asking him, I said, should we be taking into account the Pasteur Act for some of our pricing strategy, or some of the
Can you
other,
just tell us what that means for the audience?
what the Pasteur Act is?
Yes.
Oh, sure. I'm going to do a terrible job at it. And probably people listening will say that's not exactly correct, but I'll tell you my
High
interpretation
level. Yes.
of the Pasteur Act is very much a kind of a pull incentive act that was bipartisan support, and was one point in time was seen to be favorably being pushed through this legislative process. I'm not going to get political, but I'm not so sure of the fate of it now, especially under the current administration, and how that is going to be seen moving forward. But I will say, in the past, there was high hopes for it to be pushed forward. The idea of the Pasteur Act is it creates a subscription model like incentive for any company that is working on an antimicrobial. And so this is really important because 90% of all new antibiotics or antimicrobials are being developed by teams who have under 50 employees. So which, by definition is a startup, and 9 out of every 10 startups will fail. So there is a high risk for all of these companies trying to develop these products, and there is very little large pharma support at the moment to continue developing these novel antimicrobials. And so the government is trying to put some legislation together to fund these startups through the valley of death, and kind of do a subscription model where I think John Rex has a newsletter where he says it's kind of like the fire hydrant. Antibiotics are the fire extinguisher for antibacterial. And so you don't need it till you need it, but when you need it then. And I think a really prime example is COVID. And so if you are able to give some of these companies some money earlier when there isn't an absolute dire need, but it allows them to continue business operations to when there is a more dire need, or to where they can get a little bit more developed, where they have different revenue streams possibly coming in, then that's the opportunity. So the Pasteur Act essentially is hopefully going to be pushed through to allow that funding mechanism to come through. I think that's
cool too. Yeah, sorry. And thank you. No, that was perfect as far as I'm concerned. And Joe, do you want to jump in as well? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, my impression is that similar legislation has been done in England and Europe. Is that true? And do we have an idea of how it's worked?
So as far as I know, yes. In the United Kingdom, the UK, they have put something together like this, and they're in the early stages of implementing it. The health economist that I'm speaking to has alluded that for us to put together a valuation and like really a pricing strategy, Pasteur Act should probably not be included in what we were doing, just because of the high risk nature, and especially now after the election of what will probably happen with America's healthcare system. However, they did say that they would be taking into consideration the UK's pricing legislation that they've put together. I'm sure it has a name that I am not familiar with, but he said, it's really important because if your product becomes part of the subscription model that the UK is putting forward, automatically the value of your product jumps to, I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but like $100 million or something. And he's like, so you can automatically work that into your company valuation and the value of your product, which is something as a small startup is really exciting to know, that you could jump from, non-dilutive funding of a few 100,000 grants here and there to automatically a potential value of 100 million. That's a really good business case for us, and, really enhances our valuation from a large pharma partnership or acquisition opportunity. And so there's a lot of value in that. But I think that is in the very early stages and still yet to be understood what that actually means and how a company can be eligible for that. So, but it's exciting to hear that it's happening and that there are opportunities.
So exciting. It's almost like seeing it as because I'm living in Silicon Valley now, this whole software trajectory where it was software that you sell once, and then it became software as a service, and it was a subscription, and that just exploded the value of all these software companies. like, are we going to really see medicine companies as a service, or, you know, like drugs as a service instead of drug as a drug, like pay for it now? And I feel like, you know, that's a really cool way to look at it. And I mean, obviously you can't hold on to hope. I know that Pasteur Act has been like, I don't know how many years it's been like kind of been thrown around, but I keep hearing about how it's not passed yet. So that makes me feel like, you know, we can't hope.
A lot of false hope that it was about to
Yeah.
be passed, raised. So hopefully, I guess we're getting
Yeah.
close on time. I guess the last thing we like to ask people is where they hope to be in 5 years, 15 years, and what are the biggest things that you envision as obstacles to keep you from getting there. Not to be pessimistic.
Yeah. Well, I'll answer it and then I'll let Mayukh answer it.
Yeah.
5 years from now. So I hope 5 years from now we have successfully executed our phase 1b/2a clinical trial for recurrent urinary tract infections, because that is what we're hoping to do about this time next year. So hopefully that's done. Hopefully we have started and we've seen great outcomes. Not only did we see treatment, but long-term reinfection protection for these mainly women who've been chronically suffering from these super debilitating infections for years. We will be starting our phase 3 with those patients, and large pharma will be so convinced by our top line readout from our phase 2 that they will be interested in being a strategic investor in some of those phase 3 and partner for those phase 3 trials. That would be really exciting. And so those would be well on their way, if not, you know, a successful phase 3 trial being close to completion. Hopefully we will be getting breakthrough therapy designation as well. So we'll be closely working with the FDA. Our second product on our profile is for bloodstream infections. So if a UTI doesn't get treated, it can turn into bloodstream infection or sepsis, which is has a high lethality rate and is very serious, puts people in the hospital. So that would be really great if we are starting on that trial for ourselves as well. That's where I like to see 5 years. 15 years, I hope we've built Phiogen out to be a super successful powerhouse phage leading company for frontline solutions to bacterial infections, and you know, on track for, if not working with a large pharma seeing the value in it as well, and bringing us alongside into their internal capabilities and really distributing our product to the patients that need it most. But I would say as an industry, I really look for phage to move as a frontline therapeutic, a frontline solution to maybe not all bacterial infections. I do think there are some bacterial infections that phage won't be a good suit for, but I do think that it is very much an untapped and underutilized biologic for the absolute need and unmet medical need that real people are suffering from today and will only grow more in the future. And I would love to see those AMR numbers come down because of solutions like phage. So that's my goal. I don't know, Mayukh, 5 and 15 years in the future, where do you see us and phage going?
Well, I mean, as a Phiogen, as you mentioned, Amanda, so that's our kind of goal for the next 5 and 15 years. But I would like to make it a little broaden overall phage as a whole. So as a phage enthusiast and being in the phage research and commercialization process for a long time, so I want to see a phage product in the market in this country. So we need to see more and more product coming up and more success in the clinical trial. Also, we need to have a successful like strategy for the preclinical to clinical translation. Whatever the things needs to be done, so we need to like a specific assay, like a CLSI kind of assay, that patient can go to the clinic, and then physicians can do a quick taste in few minutes or few hours, and then come up with a specific drug. So that is very needed. And so that kind of effort we need to have. And then down the line, again, I would like to see the bacteriophage as mainstream because it has a huge potential, not only as an antibacterial modality, also to combat the current antimicrobial resistance crisis. So that's all.
Thank you so much, both of you, all of you, for being here. And so, like, my main takeaway from this is that based on the fact that you're actually going and taking a shot and you know all the math and you know the history of what's failed and all the bankrupt companies and you know about what Center for Medicare thinks is reimbursable in theory and you're still going ahead, therefore it must be in your mind possible with these economics. And you said you're not waiting for Pasteur to pass, you're not factoring that in as like a requirement. So based on the current numbers and the current willingness to pay of the payers and the conversations you've had, it is actually doable. Would you say that's the case?
I would say as long as people are dying and there are unmet medical needs, it is doable. Getting the business model to support that is going to be more challenging, but it is a real problem. There are people dying and there are people suffering. And so as long as that will be the case, there is a need. Now, how that business model will fit, I think will come, but absolutely.
Awesome. Joe, any last words?
No, thanks for taking the time to talk to us. And yeah, it was a great conversation.
Oh, cool. Yeah. I'm going to come up with more questions, but you'll be gone. So we'll have to have you on again one day.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for having us. It was great being here.
Yay. Well, good luck with fundraising.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Joe.
See you soon.